There are moments when nothing is actually happening, and yet your mind refuses to slow down. You're not in danger, you're not late. No one is asking anything from you, and still your thoughts keep moving, as if something important might be missed if they stop. It often shows up in quiet spaces, late at night when the day is technically over, early in the morning before anything has started, or in those in-between moments when your body is still but your attention isn't. You replay conversations that already ended. You anticipate situations that haven't arrived. You explain yourself internally to people who aren't there, not because you want to, but because the mind seems unwilling to stand down. And what makes this difficult to explain is that, on the surface, your life may look fine. No crisis, no obvious threat, no single problem demanding this level of vigilance. Yet internally, there's a sense of being on, alert, scanning, slightly braced. Some people describe it as restlessness. Others call it overthinking. But neither word quite captures the experience. Because it's not chaotic, it's organized, purposeful even. Your thoughts aren't random, they're circling, returning to the same questions in slightly different forms, running quiet simulations, checking angles, rehearsing responses you may never need. And if you listen closely, there's often a subtle urgency beneath it all, a feeling that slowing down would be irresponsible, that rest might come at a cost, that if you stop paying attention, something important could slip through unnoticed. So the mind keeps moving, not loudly, not dramatically, just persistently. This is usually the point where people start blaming themselves. They assume something is wrong with their focus, their discipline, their ability to relax. They say things like, I should be able to shut this off by now, or other people don't seem to struggle like this, or why can't I just enjoy the quiet when I finally have it? But what's rarely questioned is why the mind is doing this at all, why it learned to stay alert even when nothing appears wrong, why slowing down feels less like relief and more like risk. Because this isn't a failure of control, and it isn't a flaw in your personality. It's a pattern, one that didn't begin randomly, and one that makes a certain kind of sense once you see where it comes from. That's what we'll begin to look at next. What you're experiencing isn't rare, even though it often feels isolating. In fact, once you begin to notice it, you start to see the same pattern everywhere. Not just in yourself, but in how people move through their lives. It usually doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly. At first, it looks like being thoughtful, reflective, careful. You replay conversations not because you enjoy it, but because something about them feels unfinished. A sentence you wish you had said differently, a tone you're not sure was understood, a moment where you wonder how you came across. So you revisit it again and again, not to torture yourself, but to resolve it. Other times, the pattern shows up as preparation. You think things through before they happen. You imagine outcomes. You rehearse responses. You plan for questions that might never be asked. On the surface, this looks responsible, competent, even intelligent. And often it is. But over time, the preparation doesn't stop when it should. It follows you into moments that don't require it, into rest, into quiet, into places where your guard could soften, but doesn't. Stillness becomes uncomfortable, not because you dislike peace, but because peace leaves space. And space invites thoughts you're not sure how to hold. So you fill the space, you scroll, you plan, you analyze, you revisit old memories or anticipate future ones. Anything that keeps the mind engaged enough to avoid dropping into uncertainty. Many people don't recognize this as a pattern because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't feel like panic. It doesn't announce itself as distress. It feels like being mentally active, like being on top of things. But underneath it is a persistent state of readiness, a subtle alertness that doesn't turn off even when the environment says it's safe to do so. This is why people often feel tired without knowing why rest doesn't always feel restorative, why relaxation sometimes brings more thinking instead of relief. And again, this isn't because something is wrong with you. This pattern develops because, at some point, being mentally active worked. Maybe you learned early that paying attention mattered, that missing details had consequences, that staying sharp kept you from being caught off guard. Maybe you learned that explaining yourself clearly prevented misunderstanding, so you learned to rehearse internally before speaking. Maybe you learned that anticipating problems helped you avoid disappointment, so you learned to scan ahead. Over time, the mind remembers what kept you steady and repeats it, even when the original situation has passed. This is why people can feel alert even when nothing is wrong, because the mind isn't responding to the present moment alone. It's responding to memory, to learned expectation, to a history of moments where slowing down didn't feel safe. So it stays active, not aggressively, but faithfully. And here's the part most people miss. This pattern is not about fear in the dramatic sense. It's about uncertainty. Uncertainty about how things will land, how others will respond, whether you'll be understood, whether you'll regret not thinking something through. So the mind keeps looping, not to punish you, but to protect continuity, to make sure nothing is missed, to reduce future regret, to stay ahead of pain that once surprised you. This is also why people trying to just relax often doesn't work, because the mind doesn't experience relaxation as neutral. It experiences it as exposure. When you stop thinking, you stop monitoring. When you stop monitoring, you risk not being ready. And readiness became important for a reason. Many people with this pattern are not fragile, they're perceptive. They notice nuance. They pick up on shifts others overlook. But that same sensitivity left unchecked can begin to turn inward. It can begin to monitor everything, including your own thoughts, reactions, and emotions. So even your inner world becomes something to manage. And the result is a life where nothing is obviously wrong, yet very little feels fully settled. This is not a small experience. It shapes how people relate, rest, speak, and choose. And it's shared far more widely than people admit. The question isn't why your mind does this. The question is what unspoken agreement keeps it going. By now, something should be settling into focus, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet recognition. Because beneath all the thinking, the scanning, the replaying, there is a belief at work. Not one you consciously chose, not one you remember agreeing to, but one you've been living by. At some point, your mind learned a rule that sounded reasonable at the time. If I stay alert, I won't be caught off guard. If I keep thinking, nothing will hurt me the way it once did. If I scan ahead, I can stay in control. This is the unspoken contract. Not written in words, but in repetition. Not reinforced by logic, but by relief, even if that relief was brief. The mind noticed something important. Thinking ahead reduced uncertainty. Replaying moments reduced ambiguity. Staying mentally active created a sense of readiness. So it kept going. And because the mind is efficient, it didn't stop using this strategy when the situation changed. It generalized it. What once protected you in a specific context became a default posture toward life. This is why trying to stop overthinking feels almost threatening, because from the mind's perspective, stopping doesn't mean peace, it means exposure. It feels like walking away from the watchtower while something valuable is still inside. So when people say, just don't think about it, the body tightens. When someone suggests letting go, the mind resists. Not because you enjoy the noise, but because silence feels like dropping your guard. This is where many people turn against themselves. They label the mind as broken. They try to discipline it. They attempt to suppress thoughts, replace them, force calm. And the mind responds by working harder, because from its point of view, you're asking it to abandon its job without reassurance. Every attempt to stop thinking sends the same message. You're doing something wrong. So the system becomes tense. Self-monitoring increases. The very thing you're trying to escape becomes louder, not because you're failing, but because the contract is still active.
And maintaining this contract comes at a cost. The cost is constant mental effort, the feeling of being on even when you're alone, the inability to fully arrive in moments that don't demand analysis. It costs you rest that actually restores, presence that doesn't require management, ease that isn't conditional on having everything figured out. And over time, it creates a subtle identity shift. You stop trusting moments where nothing is happening. You begin to associate calm with risk. You confuse vigilance with responsibility. So the mind keeps negotiating on your behalf, scanning for threats that may never come, preparing for conversations that may never happen, rehearsing responses for situations that no longer exist. And here's the part that often lands hardest. This strategy didn't start because you were weak. It started because you were attentive, because you learned quickly, because you adapted. The problem isn't the intelligence of the system. It's that no one ever renegotiated the contract. The mind is still operating as if the past is about to repeat itself, even when the present doesn't require that level of defense. And until that relationship shifts, the thinking doesn't slow. Not because you can stop it, but because stopping was never the agreement. Understanding this doesn't fix anything immediately, but it changes the ground you're standing on. Because now, the mind isn't an enemy. It's a loyal guard that never received new instructions. And what comes next isn't control. It's something far more stabilizing. Observation.
Once this is seen clearly, something begins to change. Not in the mind itself, but in your relationship to it. Because if the mind has been guarding, scanning, anticipating, then fighting it was never going to bring relief. It only confirmed that something was still dangerous. This is where a quieter form of power enters. Not through intervention, through observation. Think about weather for a moment. When clouds move across the sky doesn't argue with them. It doesn't chase them away or ask them to hurry. It allows movement without becoming the storm. Thoughts work the same way. They pass through awareness, but they are not awareness. They create sensation, but they are not identity. They generate urgency, but they are not instruction. The tension you've been carrying doesn't come from the thoughts themselves. It comes from posture, the stance you've had to hold toward them. Constant engagement, constant correction, constant evaluation. Imagine holding your body slightly braced all day long. Not fully tense, just never at rest. That's what mental effort often looks like. Observation changes the posture. Instead of leaning forward into every thought, you create space behind it. Instead of reacting from inside the noise, you step back just enough to see the pattern. This isn't detachment, it's orientation. You don't ignore thoughts, you notice them. You notice how certain ones arrive with urgency but no substance, how others repeat themselves without bringing new information, how some feel loud simply because they're familiar. And slowly, the mind begins to sense something different. It senses that it doesn't have to prove anything, that its activity is being seen, not judged, that awareness is present without resistance. This is why observation is stabilizing. A system relaxes when it's not being corrected constantly, when it doesn't have to defend its purpose, when it's allowed to exist without being forced into silence. Relief doesn't come from winning against the mind. It comes from no longer wrestling it. The moment you stop treating every thought as a command or a problem, the system recalibrates. Not instantly, but steadily. The waves still move, the weather still changes, but you're no longer inside it, trying to control the sky. You're standing in a wider field of awareness, steady enough to let movement happen without losing yourself in it. This is where calm deepens. Not because the mind has gone quiet, but because you no longer believe you have to follow it everywhere it goes. When this begins to land, something subtle shifts. Not because you've learned a new technique, not because you've finally figured it out, but because the story you've been telling yourself about this experience starts to change. What you've been calling overthinking wasn't a flaw. It was an ability that stayed switched on too long.
The same mind that replays conversations is a mind that notices nuance. The same sensitivity that scans for what might go wrong is the sensitivity that reads rooms, understands people, anticipates consequences. Nothing here was random. Nothing was weak. It was intelligence trying to protect continuity, awareness trying to prevent rupture, a system that learned early that staying alert mattered. When that scene, judgment softens. You stop relating to yourself as someone who needs fixing and start recognizing someone who adapted well, perhaps too well, to uncertainty. And something else becomes possible. Rest that doesn't feel like collapse. Stillness that doesn't feel like negligence. Quiet that doesn't mean you're missing something important. Because rest doesn't mean you stop being aware. It means awareness no longer has to brace itself. There's a difference between vigilance and presence, between monitoring and inhabiting. And once that difference is felt, even briefly, the nervous system begins to take a different cue. Not stand down, but you don't have to hold this alone anymore. This is where the breath naturally deepens, where the shoulders lower without being told, where the inner volume drops, not because it was forced down, but because it's no longer needed. You're not abandoning clarity, you're reclaiming it without the tension attached. And in that recognition, something loosens. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to feel the space that's been there underneath the effort the whole time. What matters most now isn't what you do next. It's what you've already noticed. Because once something has been seen this clearly, it doesn't disappear when the video ends. It lingers. It shows up later, in the pause before you spiral, in the moment you realize you're scanning again, in the quiet recognition of, this is my mind trying to help. Awareness doesn't demand effort. It carries itself forward. You may find later today or tomorrow that the thoughts still come, but they arrive into a slightly different space, a space where you're no longer entirely inside them, and that difference matters more than it sounds. There is nothing here to fix, practice, or perform, only something to keep noticing. How the mind speeds up when it doesn't feel safe, how it softens when it's finally understood, how much of what we struggle with loses its grip once it's seen without judgment. If any part of this reflected something you've been living with quietly, a pattern you've never quite named, a tension you've learned to carry, you're welcome to acknowledge it here, not as a confession, not as a solution, just as recognition. You can share what you noticed if you want to, or simply sit with it a little longer. This space isn't about answers. It's about learning to see, and that process doesn't end, it deepens. Whenever you're ready to continue observing, you know where to find it.